Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Letwin. I'm with the host committee for Eradicate the Hate Summit, and I want to welcome those who are attending in person as well as those who are attending by live stream. Just to make sure we're all in the right place, this is panel 5.10, Protecting Democratic Values and Building Resilience. I think you've heard before in probably other sessions, the way questions are being handled is we ask you to scan your QR code up there on the screen and submit the questions electronically. I also want to remind everybody in the panelists that I commend everybody to the bios in the programming. They're pretty complete, and not in order to get programming, more of the program elements, we're not going to spend a lot of time on bios. But with that, I'll introduce our moderator, Krista Sperling, who's the co-founder and board member of We the Veterans.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for joining us. A few years ago, I started to see someone I love going down a path of misinformation and conspiracy. And as a veteran, when she started to question my patriotism, it was really jarring to me. Not long after that, I started seeing her sharing anti-Semitic views that she didn't even realize were anti-Semitic. And I think this really illustrates the way that extremist organizations and bad actors use patriotism as a way to disguise their views, to desensitize societies to violence, to divide society, and to undermine our democracy. And at We the Veterans, we really believe that the very things that make the military, the veteran, and military family community targets for these sorts of bad actors are exactly the thing that are going to make them able to lead our way out of this. They've already shown their commitment to our country and their willingness to serve, and we just want to give them opportunities to do that again, and we know that they'll step up, and we'll talk more about that later. So in this panel, we're going to talk about how we might create those opportunities to strengthen American democracy at the societal level, to help protect the norms of nonviolent response to conflict, and to crowd out vulnerabilities to radicalization and misinformation. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start with some of the challenges that have been identified in engaging with this population and creating those effective solutions. So Dan, your organization, More in Common, has done extensive research to understand what's causing societies to divide around debates around identity and belonging, and why people have become increasingly persuaded to see many debates through an us versus them lens. Will you share a bit about what you've learned about veterans in American society?
Sure, happy to. And if we don't mind pulling up the slides, thank you. So More in Common is a public opinion research that studies polarization, division, and social cohesion in the US as well as abroad. And I'm going to lay out the context for our conversation today in terms of how Americans are feeling in general, and then specifically how veterans are feeling, with an emphasis on how they're feeling towards the broader society. And all the data that I'm going to share comes from surveys that we have done over the past 2 years. So to start things off, Americans feel intensely divided. So the word that Americans are most likely to choose to describe the country today is divided. So you can see here on the list shown. And we gave them positive options, and none of them rose to the top anywhere near as did divided. And so we are primed to see things through an us versus them lens in this context. And for our conversation today, we're also just a year out from a very chaotic evacuation from Afghanistan. And so here we're showing Americans' attitudes towards the Afghanistan war, the Vietnam War, World War II. And the takeaway from this slide is that Americans feel very negatively about the experience in Afghanistan. They don't view it as a righteous cause. They don't feel like we ended the war honorably. And unsurprisingly, with that as backdrop, veterans feel a deep sense of estrangement from the broader society. So you can see that 6 in 10 veterans say that sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own country, close to 8 in 10 among Afghanistan veterans. And similarly, veterans are also carrying a significantly intense set of emotions about the way that we ended things in Afghanistan, saying that they feel things like betrayed, anger, humiliated, disappointed. And in the context of how we understand relationships between veterans, the military community, and the broader society, what we can see here is that overwhelmingly, Americans in general, but in particular veterans, feel like most Americans stopped caring about the war in Afghanistan a long time ago. This sense that this thing which has so much importance to a particular community means nothing to the broader society, and that how that can then feed into narratives of us versus them. And now thinking about some of the headlines we're seeing in terms of conversations about civilian-military relations, you can see that although feelings towards the military community are very high still, this is a thermometer score showing how positively Americans feel towards various groups, and towards the average soldier or member of any service, Americans still feel very warmly. Views are polarizing. So if we compare the warmth Americans feel towards military veterans, for example, with how they feel towards American military leaders, you can see some of that us versus them that is now seeping into intra-military views, with the officer corps and the senior leadership being viewed much less warmly relative to the average kind of service member. And similarly, Americans are unsure what the narrative is for today's veterans. They know that they're different from World War II veterans. They think they're somewhat similar to Vietnam veterans, but there's not a clear arc that we can help contextualize the journey that so many veterans are going on today. And I'll close with a couple slides showing where things stand right now. And so again, veterans are still viewed very positively as exemplars of civic responsibility. So you can see there, we did a survey where we did a control and a test group. And overwhelmingly, in the control group, close to 6 in 10 felt like veterans are role models for good citizenship. But that trust, that warmth is predicated on a very weak foundation. So when we did an experiment and exposed people to a very neutral framing of news coverage about veterans in January 6th, both as perpetrators of the attack and as members of law enforcement defending it, that feeling of trust in veterans dropped 9 points. So we don't have a very robust civilian-veteran relationship where that trust is anchored in a strong way. And finally, in terms of concerns about extremism, we don't see it as being rising to the top for most Americans when they think about the military. But again, in a context where we don't have robust relationships, you can see how concerns about extremism become the way in which many Americans might interpret all veterans, or might see it as disproportionately large relative to what it actually is among the veteran and military community. To close on a more optimistic note, I do want to underscore there's lots of space for common ground and working together across the veteran and broader society. So what this slide shows is that we have over 70% support among Americans in general and veterans specifically for doing things like ensuring all veterans have access to mental health, ensuring veterans have basic needs met, but also, and importantly here, overwhelmingly, veterans and Americans want to do civic work together. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks, Dan. Ryan, who kindly stepped in when Hala first got sick and couldn't join us today. Ryan, I want to take it over to you and hear about some of the challenges you're seeing at DHS.
Thanks, Krista. I really appreciate it. My name is Ryan Garfinkel. I work at our Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. Hala sends her regards. She wishes she could be here today. I think what Dan was closing on, the space for common ground, is actually one of the things that we're seeing a lot and that we hope continues to push forward, both in the veteran space but also broadly in America. Our center works to prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism. These are low-frequency, high-impact forms of violence. And we do this by providing educational, technical, and financial assistance to folks all over the country who are actually going to be able to do this work. Because frankly, if I knock on your door and say, I'm from DHS, I'm here to help, I think we all know how that's going to go over. At the end of the day, prevention happens locally. Just like the connections that Dan was talking about, just like some of the really good work that all the other panels have been talking about, it's the people who are closest to the ground who know what their friends and families and colleagues need. And those are the people that we want to resource and make sure that they have the tools in their toolkits to make sure that at the end of the day, we're trying to get to people before they need help and not when they're in crisis. And so our center provides grants funding. We just released $20 million of grants last Thursday. START, which is in the room, is providing some funding, I believe, to We the Veterans, who's Krista's organization, doing some really amazing creative work in this space. And there are plenty of other people who are bringing creative, innovative thought to the ways that we can try and stymie these particularly harmful forms of violence.
Thanks. Zach, I want to go to you. We know trust in the media has been declining overall, and I'd like to hear from you about what that means for democracy and some of the opportunities that you're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Zach Badworth with Military Veterans and Journalism, and our focus is getting more veterans into news. They are vastly underrepresented. Roughly 2% of journalists across the country are veterans, but if you look at the broader veteran population, it's roughly 7.5% of Americans who have served. So why is this important? We think that, as was mentioned, trust levels are abysmal right now for the media amongst the most distrusted organizations and institutions across the United States, whereas veterans are trusted as messengers. So not only can veterans bring more trust to the media, but also veterans need to have a voice and be part of the national conversation, helping to shape the narrative around veterans and bring some nuance and better understanding of some of these very complex issues. There were, for example, a percentage of veterans who participated in the January 6th insurrection. The initial reporting showed roughly 1 in 5 of those people who were prosecuted were veterans. But in fact, over time, that shifted down to roughly, I think it's roughly 10 or 11%, which is more on par with the percentage of veterans. So initially, and if you still search on Google, for example, if you search veterans and January 6th, you're going to see that 20% statistic, which creates a disconnect, and that broadens that civilian-military divide. So again, part of what we're trying to do by getting more vets into media is to bring more nuance, better understanding, and to explore some of these more complicated issues.
I think what you said about veterans and representation is really important because it feeds into the veteran stereotypes that Americans tend to put veterans on a pedestal and forget that we're individuals. Dan, can you talk about how that's showing up in your research?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And as Zach was speaking, it just struck me that one of the reasons why what Zach's organization does is so important is that from our research, looking at polarization across many Western democracies, America has the most fractured media landscape on a left-right basis. It is by far among the most polarized media information landscapes. And as a consequence, what that means is when considering groups who are different from you, whether that is ideologically, demographically, in any kind of background, increasingly we see very narrow slices of those groups. And as human beings, we all know people are complex. Groups are complex. We're all three-dimensional, and we all have strengths and weaknesses and faults that we are dealing with at any given time. And having veterans as the storytellers will help elevate that more complex picture of who veterans actually are, the strengths, the weaknesses, all the things that happen within the community. And we need so much more of that. We need more opportunities to add complexity to how all of us see groups that are different from us. But in the context of veteran and civilian relationships, this becomes even more critical for both veterans groups to do more of and for civilian groups to do more of as well.
And I think that type of complexity and sort of nuancing our thinking around each other is really important for the type of prevention work that we're trying to do. I mean, frankly, the more that we build societies and communities that accept everybody in those societies, the more resilient we build our communities, the less likely we are, in theory, to have to deal with these terrible acts of violence. At the end of the day, nonviolent response to a conflict or a grievance is an inherently democratic value. And I think that's sort of the common thread between what we've been discussing so far.
Ingrid, can you just build on what Ryan just mentioned about how civic engagement can help crowd out those vulnerabilities to misinformation and radicalization of violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Ingrid Sunley, and I'm spearheading the Vet the Vote campaign. And the Vet the Vote campaign is a civic call to action to bring 100,000 veterans and military family members, my father was in the Army, together to be poll workers for not just the 2022 election, but all of the elections forthcoming. We're trying to create a new civic norm, a positive civic norm within the veteran community. And I'd love to share a stat that I think really illustrates that desire for community, that desire to step up. Last week or so, the VA put out an article about Vet the Vote. It was an invitation to the veteran and military family community to step up and be poll workers. The next morning, when I checked the stats on the VA article, I saw that 70,000 people had read that VA article. And then, when I got my report as to how many people had signed up overnight to be poll workers, it was 34,000 veterans and military family members. In one night, 70,000 people saw the call. 50% of them responded. And I think that really speaks to this desire to forge a community, to engage in local ties, and to really be part of those local actions that bolster our democracy, crowd out vulnerabilities to extremism and bad actors. And when we are engaging in civics, like being a poll worker, we're learning how to operate in the gray spaces of our democracy. We're navigating compromise, we're navigating debate. We're remaining calm in situations that may be tense, but frankly, usually are not. And so I think poll working is a wonderful recurring commitment to our democracy that our veterans and military family members can make.
Zach, will you talk about the initiative you're building through military veterans and journalism and how you expect that to support democracy and build resilience within our community?
Yeah, thank you. So in some previous work I've done over the years, I've worked to counter ISIS and al-Shabaab propaganda. And so ISIS would reach out to people in places like Belgium or the United States or Indonesia and try to recruit these foreigners to join ISIS, the caliphate in Syria and Iraq, to gain professionalism, perceived credibility, skills, financial support, political support, and it worked. The propaganda was very successful. I've sitting down and interviewed some of these former extremists who have been jailed in northeast Syria, and they told me again and again how powerful these media messages were in convincing them to join the cause. And likewise, we've seen how anti-democratic and white supremacist groups are targeting veterans. They're wanting military skills, they want the perceived professionalism, perceived patriotism, all these sort of things to get them to join their ranks as well. So we at Military Veterans and Journalism want to do something to counter this disinformation, this propaganda. And so we want to do that by creating a reporting team specifically working on this beat, exploring and exposing and investigating some of these organizations and what they're up to. So we're seeking funding, so if you know anybody who might be interested, please let me know. A reporting team, investigative reporter, multimedia reporter, breaking news reporter that would file stories for Military Times, a prominent publication in the military space, share that with military.com, another big media outlet, and Task and Purpose. And then larger stories would hit a broader national audience through a partnership that we've developed with the Associated Press. And so all of that would be amplified through my organization working to market and push this information into different corners of the internet, Facebook groups, TikTok, et cetera, and collaborate with organizations like PolitiFact and Pointer, as well as the START program, which we're very excited we'll be able to partner with their on-the-ground efforts as well to work locally in communities. And so again, this is all about exposing, informing the community, countering the disinformation, and is strengthening this pillar of democracy and getting more vet voices heard.
Thanks. Dan, I want to come back to you. You talked a lot about the civilian-military divide. What are some of the solutions that you're thinking about to address that?
Yeah, appreciate that. So the big question, what do we do about this? What we find consistently is the way to reduce polarization and build healthier, more cohesive societies is that a healthy democracy is underpinned at an important level by a sense of a shared fate, right? This sense that we are in things together is what binds people across many lines of difference. And in a pluralistic, diverse, hyper-connected country like America, that becomes even more essential that we do it in cross-cutting ways. And so just broadly speaking, there's kind of three things that we should do. One, and it speaks to what Zach's organization is trying to do, which is complexify, if that's a verb, I don't really know. But the stories that we hear about other groups, trying to see that broader picture, trying to see people with the more nuance and gray areas that we know exist and that we want other groups to see ourselves as. So we need to think about how our stories that we are consuming, telling, and shaping, and how they affect our influences of other people. Second is build relationships. And this is why Vet the Vote is such a perfect example of what we need a lot more of, because trust is ultimately built by people doing things together. Solidarity and purpose is what binds us as human beings and as groups. And Vet the Vote is doing this in a nonpartisan, kind of healthy civic way of making relationships form. And this gets to the third point. We need to take the abstraction out of conversations about democracy, right? There's a huge debate in the country about what democracy means, what we should be doing to strengthen it. It is oftentimes articulated in very abstract ways that remove people and remove place, where so much of our democracy, so much of it is underpinned by what happens in polling booths, what happens in town halls, what happens in libraries and convention centers in places like Pittsburgh. And so when Vet the Vote takes that and puts people in places where they can get to know the process, they can feel and experience the norms, and when they can be that trusted messenger with people that they know and who they respect and are respected by, we see that ripple through and improve the overall society.
I love to tell the story of my now friend, Thomas Hickson. About 3 weeks ago, someone I'd never heard of on Twitter tagged Vet the Vote, and it was a picture of this guy, Thomas, and he was standing outside of an election training center, and he was saying, excited to start my first training, hashtag Vet the Vote. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I reached out to him and I said, hey, we would love to share your story on social media. can you tell us why you decided to sign up with Vet the Vote and how your training's going? And he said he wanted to sign up because he had a brother that was involved in local politics, so he wanted to find ways to support his brother who was doing this. And then he said in his training, the first thing that he noticed immediately was that serving as a poll worker dispelled myths about the election. So with Vet the Vote, we also have the dual benefit that by having veterans, military family members become stakeholders in our elections, we are countering malinformation about our elections, and we are giving them buy-in to the civic process. Thomas also noted that when he is serving as a poll worker, he's meeting people that are crossing class, race, and age lines. And you don't just do this once. You have to do your training as a poll worker, you have to come back and work at the polls, and then hopefully every other year at least, and every year in some cases for special elections, you're meeting these people again, you're seeing your community again, and you're forging those deeper relationships.
It's really programming like this that is, I think, I want to draw a through line here. I think people who walked in this room probably would not have thought that participating as a poll worker had any relevance to preventing acts of targeted violence and terrorism. But I want to underscore that it's a program like this which brings people into the civic process that normalizes how you should deal with a grievance. Targeted violence and terrorism are grievance-motivated forms of violence. They're people who believe generally that their violence is justified because of whatever is going on in their worldview. That is not the way we handle things in this country. In this country, if you do not like what's going on, you pound pavement, you sign petitions, you talk to your neighbors, you knock on doors, you call your representatives, and you vote. Mm-hmm. And it is programs like this that emphasize those norms and bring us together and also decrease some of the polarization we're seeing that might drive people to believe in those grievances and feel that they're so justified in that violence in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about local journalism and how that fits into this?
Sure. So another trend that we're seeing throughout the media industry is a decimation of local news outlets, lack of advertising, lack of philanthropic support. It's a real struggle, and outlets across the country locally are shutting down at pretty alarming rates. Bigger outlets like Gannett, for example, are coming in and buying the smaller ones as well, and the content that they use is it means that less reporters are there, and that means the newsrooms are less representative of the communities on which they're reporting. And that means that if you look at the dismal amount of veterans who are in journalism, we're having even less veterans in local media. So for us, another emphasis, and one thing that we're trying to do, is get more veterans into local journalism outlets. So we have done local fellowships, working with the Wyncote Foundation, for example, out of Philadelphia, to get a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And this is another sort of model that we're hoping to replicate in other parts of the country as well.
Can I just jump in on that and underscore the need for what local news does very well, which is add those kind of complex stories. We did a study in 2019 where we measured people's what we call perception gaps, which was the degree to which we are prone to exaggerate the extremity of, in this context, our ideological opponents. So we asked Democrats and Republicans, what do you think the other side believes? And what we found consistently on both sides was that the more likely you were to consume cable news, for example, the more inaccurate your views of the other side were. And local news had a much less noticeable impact on widening that perception gap. And it underscored for us, reducing polarization, one of the ways that you do it is by getting people to stop seeing the other side as a monolith that is more extreme than the diverse array of people that constitute that political group actually are in real life.
So, you know, what's striking me about this conversation is how both simplistic and complex this is a solution. This just community building, right? And community building and making people feel part of something. And that's been a theme throughout the entire conference. And so what we've discussed here in terms of solutions for strengthening American democracy at the societal level and within the community level is emphasizing opportunities for veterans to join non-veteran organizations. So creating opportunities for veterans and civilians to get to know each other. Creating a new civic norm in the veteran and military family community through efforts like Vet the Vote. Ensuring veterans are represented in newsrooms and can shape the narrative around our community, as well as being supportive of local journalism. veteran-to-veteran communication. Is there anything that I missed that has come to mind for you all?
Well, one of the things that Vet the Vote is hoping to do as part of our long-term plans, in addition to continuing to run our poll worker recruitment campaigns, is we're also looking at ensuring that military family members are also play a crucial role in civic engagement. So one of the issues that we face right now with poll workers is that military family members may be stationed in a state like Virginia, for example, where I live, where you are not able to be a poll worker because you might be a resident of Montana or Washington State. And so you want to engage in this new community where you could be stationed for 2 years, 4 years, however long, but you're not given that opportunity. So Vet the Vote is looking to draft language around a residency exemption for military family members to ensure that they are also able to engage in their communities and have those opportunities for civic engagement.
That's great. So before we move to Q&A, so how do we do this? Dan, let's start with you.
Sure, and I think we had a couple great examples already about how do we do this well. You have Vet the Vote as kind of a prime example of an organization that is doing this work actually right now happening, as Ingrid just relayed with the stats. We have Zach and the Military Veterans in Journalism trying to add complexity to both who the storytellers are and the stories that are being told. I think there's things that we can do as individuals in terms of diversifying our media consumption, in terms of trying to think about how we actively engage with groups that are different. But I would just kind of double-click on what we're talking about, which is kind of non-transactional relationship building. So increasingly in our society, we engage people only when we want them to do something that we think is important. We go to them, and this is true of both civilians and veterans. We tend to go to other groups and say, hey, I care a lot about this cause, or I want you to support me in X. And that is the nature of the relationship that we do with one another, and it builds weak levels of trust. We need to build our collective capacity to solve problems together, whatever those problems may be. And that starts by doing non-transactional relationship where I go to you and I say, what do you care about? What do we care about? What can we work on together collectively? And not try to move you to just follow my agenda, whatever my agenda might be. And I think that that's true of all the programs that we've talked about today, but we need a lot more of it.
Yeah, I think scaling a lot of these initiatives on the community level, we've talked a lot this week about transitioning out of the military and how can we build these programs that have non-transactional relationships more thoroughly into that transition process. So our idea, when somebody leaves the military, they learn that they can sign up to help out after a disaster with Team Rubicon. They can join one of Mission Continues service platoons, and they can sign up to support democracy through Vet the Vote. There need to be many initiatives available to people because just being a poll worker isn't going to create enough engagement. We need to have many avenues of that and avenues that appeal to all interests. So keeping these non-transactional service organizations front and center for both the veteran and military family community, I think is a really important way to scale.
It's hard to follow up these two really amazing responses. And I guarantee you, Zach, will continue to add to this conversation. I'm going to take it back to what my center focuses on, which is targeted violence and terrorism, and sort of contextualize. I think a lot of what we're talking about here applies broadly. We're talking about this in the frame of veterans and in the frame of civic norms. But frankly, reinforcing civic norms are things that all communities can benefit from, and they can build protective factors against violence across the country, no matter whether you're a veteran, a civilian, or some other group. And I think also one of the things that is important to emphasize is the creative and innovative ways that we are trying to approach these challenging problems. This is hard work, and it will continue to require thoughtful, careful, and frankly, groundbreaking innovation. Most people, like we already discussed, might not have thought that there's a through line between civic participation and prevention of violence. And we need people who are going to bring that type of creativity to this problem set, whether it's in the veteran space or in a different type of space, to that prevention challenge in order to reduce the number of times that we have to deal with targeted violence and terrorism.
So I come at it from a media lens and how we think about our national conversation, our narrative around these very complex issues. And so I just want to emphasize the value and the importance of thinking about how people are consuming information, how they're being swayed over to one persuasion or one ideology over another, and how we can combat these extremist ideologies. So for me, that means that thinking about democracy, thinking about journalism as a place to invest, put the resources that are necessary for programs like the ones that we're pitching, and also just making sure that our media itself remains diverse and representative of our communities, which includes incorporating veterans.
Okay, great, thank you. So we do have a couple of questions. Ingrid, this one is for you. Can you speak about how Vet the Vote and other civic engagement activities will continue between election cycles? In this space, we experience boom and bust funding cycles, so important work often ceases between election cycles due to lack of resources, while anti-democratic activities and recruiting continue.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a fantastic question. One of the most important components of Vet the Vote is ensuring that the narrative that veterans are on the job and are working the polls and protecting our elections becomes part of the general public's consciousness. So we are going to spend a lot of our time after this election cycle, and for the record, I would say the election cycle doesn't end until the next Congress is seated, so we're looking at through January. We want to make sure that the narrative about veterans working, this is going to include testimonials from people like Thomas, are put into very professional video production, that they are getting out there across social media channels. We're going to use PR agencies if we have the resources to do it. And we are going to ensure that people know that veterans are on the job, that military family members are on the job, because we have that trusted community. We have this trust that Dan was talking about. And we want to leverage that to make sure that people are aware that we are out there working the polls and that our elections are safer for it.
Can I just add on to this?
Yeah.
So one of the things that Warren Common thinks a lot about in terms of just strengthening democracy more generally is how do we tell more stories of a bigger us? And it speaks to that first slide I shared where Americans feel very pessimistic about the state of the country right now, divided. They don't feel like we can accomplish things anymore together. And democracy requires some sort of sense that if I enter into this relationship with my fellow citizens, something will happen. It doesn't need to be a victory in my agenda, but I need to believe that my time is being put towards something constructive, and Americans are skeptical about that. And there's a lot of probably good reasons why there's a degree of hesitancy about what we produce, but Vet the Vote is proving that we can still do this. And it is one example of the many that are happening right now, but telling that story of a bigger us after the election cycle will have such a profound impact on getting people to remember again that, yes, we can do this. Yes, there are things that we are in together and not divided along a red-blue line.
I love that, telling stories of a bigger us.
Yeah.
Zach, I think that's something maybe you can help us with sometime, right?
I hope so.
I love that. Ingrid, this one is also for you. How will Vet the Vote poll workers be distinguished from poll workers who sign up based upon the exhortations of extremist candidates who are urging their supporters to work the polls, presumably with the goal of voter intimidation?
Sure, it's a really complicated question. And one thing that I would say is that Vet the Vote, we're recruiting poll workers, but poll working is a very decentralized thing across the entirety of our country. It's down to townships, counties, and states that all have different rules. But with these rules come checks and balances. So you can have people with ill intent sign up to be a poll worker, but you're also going to have a number of other people, many veterans and military family members included, that are there with the right intent, with civic intent. And actually, Zach is one of our Vet the Vote registrants that recently completed his training, so I'd actually love to hand it over to you to talk about how you saw those checks and balances come into play.
Yeah, so I'm now officially a voting operator judge, something like that, some fancy title. And I went through training on a Thursday night for 3 hours, went through and tested the polling machines, and it was really, I mean, I've voted before, obviously, so I see the process, but to know that there are those various checks and balances from the various parties signing off on discarded ballots, for example, and I think that just getting veterans into the room to be able to see the process themselves, understand that, in fact, it's a very arduous bureaucratic process to count the votes, that it's very secure, all these things will really help to underscore and strengthen our trust in that institution and our democracy more broadly.
I love that. Last question here. What role do you see VSOs playing in closing the civilian-military divide? And I recognize that none of our panelists are leading VSOs, but Dan, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a really important question because obviously VSOs, veteran service organizations, have a huge impact on how veterans engage with society. They are probably the most consequential political mobilization organization for veterans, often around issues that are specific to the veteran community or to the military community more generally. And I think that there are probably two ways that VSOs could play an even more constructive role in our democracy. And I should start by prefacing that a lot of the VSOs, whether it's the American Legion, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan Veterans of America, we mentioned Mission Continues, et cetera, like lots of these great groups, are doing so much just by providing a sense of belonging in place for veterans after they transition out of the military. There is a crisis of belonging that has been well described in American context, but I'll just underscore by, in our survey research, 1 in 3 Americans said that there is no community to which they feel a strong sense of belonging. So again, 1 in 3 Americans, no community that they feel a strong sense of belonging. And to your example that led off this whole panel, what people are seeking right now is solidarity and purpose. And so if we're not providing solidarity, there is very little we can do to get somebody to be engaged in democracy. So VSOs are already doing a lot in that sense. The two things that they probably could do more of, one, as we have underscored already, we need more programming that brings veterans to engage non-veterans in the broader civilian society for purposes that are not advocating for veteran-specific causes. We need to have that non-transactional relationship building. Groups like Team Rubicon do a fantastic job around this, Mission Continuous Service Platoons. Many groups are already doing this, but we need a lot more. And in part because it's not that veterans should take the first step. Everybody should be doing more of this on all sides. But certainly veterans have a lot of credibility, and if they were to lead these kind of efforts, you would see communities mobilize them because they would recognize that they want to be supporting veterans and engaging with them. So one is stepping up that level of engagement. And two, it is thinking about how we can get veterans to be more into the storytelling experience. So again, in ways that where veterans are not just messengers for veterans' causes. I think that that's where VSOs could play an important role in helping veterans to recognize their power and potential as storytellers and getting them positioned with groups like Zach's, but by also at the local level, getting them more connected to all kinds of news and media and community messaging kind of forums where you can bring that more complex picture of veterans to light and help educate or at least share with the broader community what the actual experience of veterans are, which is probably very different from what people imagine them to be.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Just to chime in and echo those points, I think sometimes media reports are very generic and simplistic when they talk about veterans. It's either the veteran who lost 2 legs, or it's the crazy veteran who shoots up a post office, for example. And it's really, veterans are, 18, 19 million people across the United States. One veteran is one veteran. It's much more complex than that. There are some trends we can look at, the percentage of veterans with post-traumatic stress, for example. But it's complex. There are lots of different communities within the veteran community. So I think that's really where the narrative, the media, we could loop Hollywood into that, really are not doing a good job, not strong enough in the reporting that they do, and that really needs to be strengthened, enhanced by, again, bringing more vets into the fold.
I think a key part of this is that these solutions that we're talking about, whilst we are talking about the veteran community here, these community-oriented solutions are important for everyone. This isn't just for the veteran community, and if we can bring everyone together to engage in this way, we can strengthen democracy overall. So I think it's important to think about the larger picture here.
Krista, you're stealing the talking points right out of my mouth. I think one thing that's worth emphasizing here, especially because we're talking about sort of prevailing narratives, and I am sitting here on a panel as a representative from DHS, is that we are well aware that the number of veterans who are mobilizing to violent criminal extremism, Bill, I'm messing up your guys' stats, but it's a statistical zero, 545-ish folks since 1990. It's still something that we care about, just like we care about anybody radicalizing to violence or mobilizing to violence. But the way that we see veterans in this space is as huge potential partners in prevention. These are folks who know how to think creatively to deal with complex solutions, lead people, and organize folks. And those are all key skill sets when you're going to mobilize a community to do anything, whether it's prevent violence or engage civically.
Yeah, that's exactly what We the Veterans is all about. exactly what Ryan just described there. We really see this opportunity to engage with this community so they can engage with their own communities, not just our community, but with their own communities, with their neighbors. They can go to the polling stations. They can tell their story about what they've seen there and help rebuild confidence in our democratic processes. Great.
Sorry, and just one last point is thinking about what you were just describing, Ryan. But also gets back to the title of this session, which is about, again, democracy. And very few groups out there are advocating something other than democracy, right? Like, we just did survey work. Everybody's concerned about the state of democracy. Cuts across ideology. You can get 9 out of 10 of any group to say the state of American democracy is not going well, and I'm concerned about it. It is the nature of the threat that diverges wildly across an ideological line in the U.S. But very few groups are out there advocating for an alternative, and that doesn't quite seem what we need to recognize as the most salient threat. But it is, what does democracy actually mean? Because when you probe on that, so when we ask people, like, how strongly do you feel about having a democratic form of government? And again, 9 out of 10 Americans will be like, I feel very strongly about it. And like, well, what does democracy mean? It's a hard question to answer, actually. Like, what does it mean? I mean, is it the free will of the people? Is it people getting to choose their own destiny? When we asked Americans, what is it that people in Ukraine are fighting for? It is the right to choose their own destiny. That was the strongest answer. And that we were framing the question in the context of democracy versus authoritarianism. I say all of this to underscore the need for kind of getting people into rooms, because democracy is a very abstract term. It is a very abstract narrative, and what is not abstract are real people doing real things together, demystifying process points, rebutting misinformation or even preempting misinformation by conveying the accurate truth and realities in an informal setting where people feel a high sense of confidence that they are respected by the person who's talking to them about it. And so as we think about whether it's VSOs, whether it's community groups, whether it's business groups, civic groups, whoever it is, we need a lot more of that kind of work if we're to strengthen democracy, particularly at a time when there is a threat in democracy, when we do see that there are, at the global level, really intense movements to try and impose upon different countries an authoritarian regime.
Okay. Any other question or any other thoughts before we close?
Well, I feel like, Dan, that was actually very inspiring. And I feel like almost a really good call to action that we all need to be stakeholders in our own democracy. And I swear this isn't just a plug for you to go to vet.vote and maybe sign up to be a poll worker. But you should think about it, and we should be taking these cues to sign up and be civically engaged and be stakeholders and tell these stories ourselves. Because we can be at the barbecue and talk about how it's a little bit bureaucratically arduous to be a poll worker, and we can tell that story and talk about those processes, and that will help reinforce these narratives throughout our communities.
You know, Dan, what you said made me think about how many people are finding community online. So I wonder, how do you create those connections online in the same way that you do through these, local in-person communities that we're talking about? Is that even possible? I mean, I think groups are proving that it is. So, what opportunities do you think are there?
Yeah, I mean, I think and just to the point about local journalism being, I mean, again, the proportion I feel like the stats on this ebb and flow, so I don't want to hang my hat on anything in particular, but I think we all can feel reasonably confident that people are getting more news online, more news from social media than they were 25 years ago or before Facebook. Like, I feel very confident in saying that is empirically true. They are also finding a lot of community. I feel like whether it is in social media, whether it is in online gaming, whether it is in the identity that forms around the media that you consume, right? Because we often think about media primarily being a conveyor of information, but if you read the New York Times, like, that's an identity. You have an identity. So people are finding community online. And there's a great debate about what are the costs and consequences of doing so. And this is where I feel like I'm going to give a very dissatisfying answer. Jonathan Haidt had a great article in The Atlantic, very, very sobering, but I would encourage folks to read it. He also then went online, because in his article he's very critical towards social media in particular, and talks about how social media has enabled us all to throw darts at each other. We live in a world of darts. So even when we're forming community, it's weak communities is his kind of proposition. But he went online and basically challenged the academic world to say, what is the data say about the health and costs of online engagement? And I think that there's a pretty robust debate. All that's a very lengthy way of explaining that we need healthier forms of online organizing and community building. Whether that happens in Facebook, TikTok, whether it happens in things like the neighborhood app or all other kinds of things, again, we need to figure out how do we make better online communities where people feel that sense of belonging without it being predicated on othering different communities.
Yeah.
I think to Dan's point, those norms around online, this is good take us to the opposite end of my brain. So this might sound like a departure, but I think the way that we engage online is also comes up a lot in our space on prevention. ADL last year, I think, or maybe it was the year before, time is now a flat circle with the pandemic, released a report discussing what people's interactions are like online, and particularly in gaming spaces. And it was like 60+% of people experience hate or bias-related speech online. It's a space that should inherently be fun to engage with and should bring joy to people's lives. And it's not very civically oriented. We don't do very nice things to each other online. And there are opportunities, I think, to take how we're talking about civic engagement here in sort of the real world and in person to the online space as well. And I think that's a really important conversation to have, particularly because we know generally the studies I've seen would indicate that like video games, there's no causal link between violent extremism. But the communities that exist around things online, whether it's gaming or Facebook or any other way that we engage online, can pull people into more extreme directions. And those more extreme directions can expose you to worse and worse things. And you can fall into what we sometimes refer to as a rabbit hole. And those are really bad outcomes. And we have an opportunity to engage and be a bit more civic and a bit just kinder to each other in order to renormalize those type of engagements and ultimately both plus up how we engage in person and online, as well as sort of build some more of those protective factors that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is while people can build community online, those communities might not necessarily be pro-democratic or supporting American democracy and civil norms. And so that's all the more reason while creating these opportunities and explaining and helping people understand the importance of being in their real life offline community is so important. Yeah.
But I would say that to agree with all that. At the same time, some of the most interesting ways to dispel misinformation in the pandemic happened on like random Reddit threads. And it was these spaces because, well, if you think about people who are, again, we have a fractured media landscape. And so if we think about reaching people who might not hold the same opinion as us, it is oftentimes because they're coming at a very different lens on what is happening in reality. Is the vaccine a good thing or a bad thing? Are our elections valid or are they invalid? Are they high integrity, low integrity? What online spaces often did well is create communities where you could ask questions that are uncomfortable to ask in most settings. Where you could be like, I'm not sure about X. And in our world of Twitter, it's very hard to do that. It's hard to put yourself out there in a space where if you feel like you're going to be judged, you're going to be criticized. And yet it's kind of a critical thing if humans are to normalize about what actually is happening in reality. You got to give people who have uncertainty space to express their uncertainty, to feel heard, and then to have their uncertainty addressed in a healthier way. And online spaces, for all of their really bad elements, oftentimes do that in ways that we've gotten worse at doing in person, or we've just stopped doing in person at all because we just kind of do a lot of our interactions online or intermediated.
I'll say that after January 6th, another personal story, I was feeling in a bad place. And like many people, I saw my friends online talking about January 6th. And eventually I said, this is not doing me any favors. I need to figure out how to do something about this. And that's how I met Ellen and Bill and Anil and the rest of the We the Veterans crew. And because of that, we've started this organization that's focused on solving this problem. And it wouldn't have happened if we would have just stayed online and complained about this. We've got to take action in our communities, and that can mean meeting with people who are part of your community virtually, but you gotta get off the internet, you gotta start doing this work. And we started because, as I shared earlier, I have an interest in mis and disinformation for personal reasons, and I've also worked in that space while I was part of the military. I lead a mis, dis, and malinformation working group. It's multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary, and we're bringing together experts who are already working in this space, along with veteran service organizations who want to help address this problem in our community. Ingrid already talked about Vet the Vote and how that's working to address the misinformation problem around the election process. And those are the kinds of novel solutions that we intend to come up with as part of our working group. So we have about 5 minutes left. Anything that you all want to say to close? Okay.
Well, so I'll just, sorry, and just on that very point, though, I feel like that's such an essential American idea to actually take action, as Ryan also alluded to earlier. This is what we do. And it underscores for me that in the conversation that we're having about democracy more generally, so this is not specific to veterans, though it certainly has relevance in the veteran context, there is a strong and natural orientation to identify concrete solutions. That to a certain degree, Americans are problem solvers. We like to think about there being specific solutions, legislation that we can pass, agendas that we can advance, technology that we can invent, which is wonderful. Love that. At the same time, and this is kind of terrifying, democracy requires us to concede control, right? We have to trust each other. And if we're convinced that half the country is not just wrong, but a threat, it's impossible. We can't have that. And so I think one of the things that we've been talking a lot about and we'll underscore and we have an opportunity to do more of is figure out ways where we can build relationships so that we can trust each other, so that we can feel comfortable conceding the control, which, by the way, isn't getting us to a healthier space right now, and figure out that at the end of the day, in important ways, we are in this together. Whether we would want to be or not, we are in this together and we have to figure out our way forward.
Anything else to add? I think that's a great note to end on. All right, thank you all so much for joining us today, and thanks for joining.